Recently, my father told me about his early conversations with God. He said, "When I was a boy, I used to walk in the woods just to see some rabbits or squirrels, just to see what I might see. And I remember walking to the back of the grove and saying to God, 'Will you walk with me and hold my hand?' And there was a big log in the woods, a fallen tree on which I used to sit and pray. I would get up early, before everyone else was awake, when the weather permitted, and I would sit on that log and talk to God about my problems, my feelings, and the things I was thinking about. I'm sorry that my father died so young, and when I was so young, and I never knew him. But I suppose I'll get to know him in heaven."
Yeah, my name is Robert Lancaster. I grew up at Rosal, Minnesota, right up close to the Canadian border, in a Swedish community, and very much influenced by my grandfather and his friends. And he was a godly man. One of his friends I remember so well, a wonderful, godly fellow. He's a farmer. He would put his hand on my head and say, "Bobby, you're going to be a preacher." And I thought, that's what you think. And he did that every time he got near me. So anyway, I was bent on being a farmer, and God called me to preach. I spent many years ministering as a pastor. I tried several times to retire from the ministry, and every time I did, another church would pop up and need a pastor. And they had desperate need of a pastor. So I retired, I think, about 6 or 7 times before I actually retired. So it amounted to 58 years in actual church ministry. I began to pastor a church at Bemidji. They had a pastor who was really trouble, and he split that church up, and there was real anger there. And in 5 years of my ministry there, the church had made peace with each other, and most of them came back, and we had peace in the church. And that was one of the ministries I had throughout the 54 years of ministry, was going into a church where they were fighting and bringing peace. John was called he was a minister of love. And I wanted to be a minister of love. And that's what God did through me. I got to the point of wanting to quit pastoring, and every time I got done pastoring, another church would come, and so I think it was 7 times that I resigned from pastoring. When I was very young, like 6, 7 years old, something like that, we didn't have a local church that we met for Sunday school, so we met at a farm. And I remember now that the teacher for the little kids like me, I was about 6 years old at that point, was telling about this man, Jesus. And he was such a wonderful man, and I was just enchanted by him. And then they crucified him, they killed him. I was just shocked. How could that happen? And the whole week it was kind of miserable. And I had a dream. It was a crazy dream, but there was these 3 crosses and 3 men on them. And there was these demons in little cars that kids used to get that you could ride in, and paddle them. And they were circling around that cross and just joyfully screaming and laughing. Now, how a little kid like that got a dream like that, I don't know. But anyway, got back to Sunday school the next Sunday, and he had been resurrected, and oh, I'm so thankful. So that was, and I just just loved that man, Jesus. Yes, there was the time that I had made a commitment to the Lord that whatever he wanted to do with me was all right with me. It was a very hard decision to make. It took me 3 days of prayer to get to that place that I could just finally say that. And then after I'd said that, there was a dream one night, and I was carrying a cross up a hill. There was 2 crosses, I suppose, up there, and I couldn't. I collapsed. I couldn't face it. And I realized what Jesus went through, but that I wasn't even able to face it. It was, and I had read about the death of John and Betty Stam, who were beheaded in China for their faith, and then that's what brought this on, because I realized that wanting to serve the Lord, I could, and I collapsed, and I knew I was too weak to be as strong as they were unless God gave me the strength. My mother became an orphan of sorts. Her mother died. In fact, their whole family moved over from Sweden. They were immigrants. They moved to Badger, Minnesota, which is up in northern Minnesota, close to Roseau. And they had a farm there. And then when my mother was 6 years old, her mother was pregnant and about to bring forth a child. It was a baby boy, and the mother died. And so the kids were given out to people who would take care of them. And so as a man and his wife that took my mother in, she was raised by them, and they were kind of tough on her because none of their kids had lived. They had all died from scarlet fever. And they had a boy by the name of Robert, and he died. I was supposed to be George Torrance or George Thomas, as by my dad's name, because it was a Lancaster family name that should be passed down. Grandma Peterson insisted on that I had to be named Robert after her son had died. And so my mother yielded, and I was named Robert, and then my mother gave me George because that was my dad's name. Grandma was a superstitious woman. Grandpa was just a marvelous Christian man. Grandma was superstitious, and she was weird at times. She would tell me that when I got to be 12 years of age, I would die because her, Robert, died at 12. I didn't believe her. And anyway, when I got 12, I had a whooping cough for a couple of months. It nearly killed me. And then as I was recovering from it, inflammatory rheumatic fever came over me. And I was 5 weeks in bed that I could not be taken out of bed. And the rheumatic fever worked from my chest to my head, and then down through my body, and then the legs, and finally the arms. And it was 5 weeks. The teacher, I was 5th grade at that time, the teacher brought my studies after school and sat and helped me study, and so I wouldn't fall behind in the grades. And so anyway, it left me with a very bad heart. And along the years until I was old enough to go into the service, I had improved my health. The doctor told me that I should not do anything but take bed rest. He didn't want me doing anything else because my heart was so bad. Well, I didn't ask him about could I ride my horses. And no, I did ask him, and he said, absolutely not. And so then I thought, well, I'd just soon die then. So I rode my horses and did other things too. And I was 19 years old when I went into the military service, and there was not a sign of heart failure. To this day, there's not. And I've done lots of exertions. And so anyway, that was a miracle from God. When I was probably 8 years old, something like that, we had an 80-acre farm, and almost half of it was woods or brush. And we had a herd of about 22 cows, and you need feed for those cows. But we also had to grow grain, and that was part of the cow feed, and the feed for the sheep, and the feed for the hogs and the chickens and everything. And so when we got the hayfield harvested, then we'd take the cows out there in the daylight and let them loose in the hayfield. But you had to have somebody out there to keep them out of the grain field. And so my mother would set me up on a big old workhorse. I didn't have any neat little riding horses then, and put me up on one of those. And she'd give me a paper bag with a sandwich and a Bible, a small Bible in it. And I'd sit on the horse, and every direction I'd sit backwards and sideways, and every direction, because I wouldn't be able to get back on if I got off. So it was from 10 in the morning till just about 4 in the afternoon that I sat on that horse, keeping the cows out of the haystack and so forth. And I did a lot of Bible reading. And I started in the Old Testament with Genesis. So was pretty much in the Old Testament. When I went into the military service during World War II, I had made up my mind that I would not do like most young men do when they come into public notice. They'll camouflage their faith. And so they'll do some swearing, they'll do some drinking. They try to act like the other guys because they don't dare. They know they'll get teased for their faith, and I knew that too. But I said, I'm not going to betray the Lord in any way. And I had promised our youth group in our church that I attended that I was going to try to be a witness for Christ. And so I started right out that way. And of course, there was the persecution, and I laughed it off. And they'd call me certain things like Rev, and that was all right. Bishop, and that wasn't quite as all right. I didn't want to have that much of a promotion right away. And anyway, I learned quite rapidly that though they tease you, though they criticize you, and though they try to get you to do the things you don't want to do, like swear or take a swig of whiskey or something like that, they really weren't that much against you. They're just, well, really defending themselves from the other guys by picking on me. And so I did manage to have some ministry amongst the soldiers. And then after the war, I'd been praying, Lord, send a real good Christian man in the new men that we get into the service after we've discharged the old fellows. And the first evening we had a bunch of new men. There was a man on a cot in our squad room reading the Bible. And I said, Lord, is this the fellow? And 9 o'clock, the guy sat up. He says, well, fellas, it's Bible reading time. So he sat up and we gathered around. In fact, he said, gather around. And we gathered around and had Bible reading. And then afterwards, he said, anybody got a guitar? And one fellow said, yeah, I can find one for you. And went out and got one and came in and we did some singing. Anyway, the guys said, this was so good, we've got to do this again. Well, it got to be every night. And one day he said to me, Bob, tonight you teach the lesson. And I said, I never taught anything or preached anything or anything. I don't have any experience. He says, you let the Holy Spirit get hold of you, and you'll be surprised what you'll do. So I got on my knees and I said, Holy Spirit of God, I give myself to you to be used in any way that you want. Sat up, opened my Bible, prepared a message, and I taught that night. And from that time on, he'd teach one night, and then I'd teach the next night. I think reading the lives of missionaries and also becoming acquainted with missionaries. So often these things were happening with them. And so I'd get into a fix where I needed help, and I'd turn to God and try to believe him for the answer I needed. Yeah, and meeting two missionary ladies from China and two missionary ladies in Japan. There was a lot to tell about the ones from China, but when the Japanese came through the town they were in, every building in the town was damaged from gunfire and so forth. And the orphanage they were running never received one bullet. And the Japanese they were expecting the door to be broken down at any minute, but the Japanese never went near it. The two in Japan, they came to our Saturday night GI revival, which we held in the Ginza Methodist Church. And they came and they asked us to pray that the army would give them a Quonset hut so they could get the orphans off the streets and get them into a home. And I thought, the army won't do that. And in fact, in our Baptist church, when we'd ask the pastor about miracles, he'd say, the age of miracles is past. And that was taught in those days. And so that's what I believed. They asked us to pray for a Quonset hut. A couple of months later, they came back, thanked us for the Quonset hut. And then they asked for transportation. And I thought, oh boy. And they were going to ask the army for a Jeep. And they got the Jeep and they got a driver as well from the army. And I tell you, my outlook on miracles was changed by those two ladies. God called me to preach. And I really hurt my mother by leaving the farm. Our dad had died when I was very young, and my brother was just born half a year after he died. Mom and Gerald had taken care of the farm. A couple of years I was in the military. They'd done well. Mom was very proud of me when I was ordained. Working in our home church the first year after the military, anyway, some way the devil had gotten hold of me and told me, this is all imagination. You don't have any born again experience. And somewhere or other I was saying, I just don't have any proof or anything. That was a crazy thing to say. Anyway, it was prayer meeting night, and I had convinced myself that the devil was right, and I wanted to go to prayer meeting, but I thought, I always pray at prayer meeting, and now how can I pray? And so I was sweating it out, and the pastor gave his teaching, and next thing was going to be prayer. And the pastor says, we'll have to forego the prayer tonight because we have to do the choir practice for the Christmas. And I was so relieved. So on my way home and thinking about it, and all of a sudden this came right out of my mouth. I knew God would work things out for me. We had a missionary, not a missionary, but from Minneapolis come up. It was a ministry that was promoting the Jewish people, and she had grew up on the farm, and her dad was very interested in the Jewish thing, and he was working out in the barn, and a salesman came, and that's the way it was years ago. Salesmen would come to your door and sell you things, you know. I mean, it might be tableware or stuff you'd get in a grocery store, or anything. This Jewish man came up. I don't know what he was selling, but she went out to the barn and said, "Dad, there's a kike. There's a kike in our house." And her dad got so angry. He said, "You're going to learn the whole Pentateuch before I let you out of the bedroom upstairs." And she lived and ate up there in the bedroom, studying the 5 books. And at the time she spoke to us, she could just quote from them. It was really impressive. But a lot of people, you know, they said slanderous things about the Jews, and her dad didn't stand for that. The Baptist church was waiting for a pastor. They had a temporary pastor, and this temporary pastor was a man by the name of Mark Hausman. He was a Ukrainian who had lived in Russia, and in fact, their family was taken to Siberia by train, boxcar, and his dad died on the way to Siberia. He grew up then there, and then got away. And when he got away, he went back to Ukraine. He worked there for a while in a mill, and then he immigrated to Canada. And there he was introduced to Prairie Bible Institute. He went there, and he had quite a few ministries, and came to Roseau, and then over to International Falls, Minnesota. He asked me to come and be his summer pastor's assistant, and so I did that, and that's where I met my wife in International Falls, and that was a wonderful experience. As a young boy, I had noticed that there was a lot of trouble in families, and husbands and wives didn't seem to love each other, and there was breakups and things like that. And so I began to pray. I don't remember the age. I've said 9 years old, but it may have been a little older than that. I began to pray that God would find the right woman for me. I did have a girlfriend at Roseau, Minnesota, and she wouldn't consider marrying me because I thought I was going to be a missionary to Japan. I wanted to go back to Japan, and she would not marry a missionary. And so then I spent that summer with Pastor Hausman, and got to know Lorraine Kelly. In fact, she came to know the Lord at one of my youth rallies. I remember I told Hausman to to talk to her, about accepting Christ, and when she had come forward, because I thought it wasn't appropriate for me to do that. So then I went out to see her, the kids that had been gathered up, or young people, they weren't kids. They'd been gathered up by a couple that brought them into town. And there she was, just the glory was just all around her. She was so thrilled and just shining. Well, ended up my wife. And that was, I had a great wife, and she was a wonderful mother for my kids, and a wonderful help in the ministry. I wasn't allowed to go back to Prairie Bible Institute that year because they have a policy that when you get married, you stay out of school for a year and you get your marriage settled, and then she found out about Oak Hills. I knew about Oak Hills Bible Institute. It was at Bemidji. And she heard a speaker from Oak Hills, and she was very impressed. And she said, we've got to go over there and talk to that guy. So we did. And then I finished up at Oak Hills Bible Institute at Bemidji, Minnesota. And I was actually ordained by a board of directors of the Oak Hills Bible Institute. Later on, when I became an evangelical free church pastor, the Evangelical Free Church ordained me. They told me it wasn't necessary, my ordination, but if I wanted them to, and I said, I want you to. There was 54 years of ministry. All of it was, including in the Free Church, all of it was by faith, trusting God. I got involved with some other ministries, and one of them was a ministry in Canada, up around the Hudson Bay area, and to the Eskimos and so forth, to the Indians and so forth up there. And there's just loads of miracles to tell about in that ministry. And I remember the director of the mission saying to me, because I was pastoring at Bemidji at the time and doing all the secretary treasury work and all the correspondence work for the mission. And he said, we're having a conference at Churchill, and I want you to be there. Well, I said, John, I don't have the money for a trip like that. He said, God didn't ask you to have the money. God asked you to go. And I went, and the Lord provided. One day, he told me he had gone down to the airport. He was a pilot also. We had 3 pilots, 2 planes, and he was a pilot. And he went down to the airport and pulled the plane up to the gas tank, and just as he was starting to put gas in, a guy tapped him on the shoulder and said, John, you got money to pay for that gas? And he says, yeah, the Lord just said I'd have it. Yeah, he told me too, the guy says. So. And that's how we lived through all our ministry. There were times I had a salary, but all the extra needs and everything, God miraculously. I could go to a list of miracles. I'll tell one. When we were working with Oak Hills Bible Institute, we had rural ministry places, and each one from the lowest student all the way up to the superintendent had a ministry spot. And on Sunday, you'd go and conduct a Sunday service and Sunday school for a community, because people didn't drive clear into town where the churches were. They were out spread all the way out in the woods and so forth. And so we were out of food, and I stopped just before we left the house, and I said to Lorraine, my wife, I said to her, let's pray, ask God for a loaf of bread. So we went, we did our preaching and teaching, came home, and I drove up to the administration building. There is a mountain of bread, a mountain of it. It was about 9 feet high and about 9 feet across at the bottom. And I went in and asked the cook there, said, did God dump bread from heaven? She says, almost. But what happened was that the superintendent had gotten his way blocked by a truck when he was coming home. And it was a bread truck. And he said he sat there waiting for the guy to move, and he didn't move. And then he got out of his truck and came back and said, could you lead me to a hog farm so I can dump a load of bread? We over-ordered or double-ordered. Jim Schreiber says, yeah, you follow me. And he took him up to the administration building right outside the kitchen, and they dumped this pile of bread. We had bread all spring because we took it and put it in our porch and froze it, and we had, and so did everybody else. But anyway, there are so many miracles that I could just talk and talk and talk about them. I had been to Churchill, Manitoba for a conference there, and God had, well, I had told our director that I didn't have money to make the trip, because he had told me he wanted me there at the conference. And he said, God didn't tell you to have the money to make the trip. He told you to go. So I took him up on it, and God did supply. And I went there, and we had a good conference. And I felt I'd like to bring my wife up there and let her see this mission. It was a mission to Eskimos and Indians and old loggers and miners, so forth up there. So I agreed that to the missionary there that I would come in July. We would come in July and help with the Vacation Bible School. And we, of course, needed money for it, but I had a glimmering of faith now on that, and I began to pray about it. And one day I was praying, and I said, Lord, the Bible says that the cattle on 1,000 hills are yours, and how about selling some of your cattle? And so one day I was out calling on people and came home, and my wife said, Mrs. Worth stopped in today, and she brought a check for $100 and wanted us to use that for the trip to Churchill. And they had sold their cattle because they were old enough to retire, and they didn't want to go into the expense of the modern sanitary things that have to be furnished by law. And so they sold some of their cattle, or most of their cattle. And she brought a check of $100 and said, we want you to make that trip. And then a couple days later, same thing. I was out calling and come back, and my wife said that Mrs. Worth came back again today, and I said, "Oh, well, what did she have to say?" Well, she brought another $100. She said, "We want you to make the trip, but we want you to come back too." So that that was just another of God's. And then there were other people that contributed, and we had a real nice trip to Churchill. I was working in a grass seed processing plant, and it was heavy work, hard work. I was in fit shape to do that kind of work, but it was a kind of a dead-end job. And I was praying to the Lord one day as I was working there. I said, "Isn't there anything else I can do?" And I was doing this work as part of supporting my ministry at a church, because they didn't pay me a full wage. It was like the Lord said to me, "Go to the Great River News and see Don Wagner." Well, Don Wagner was that man that my wife had first met and got me interested in Oak Hills at Bemidji. And his family were a printer family. And so the Lord was saying to me, "Go to the Great River News and see Don Wagner." Well, I said, "What should I do that for?" At noon, I started out and I said, "I'm not going to the Great River News, I'm going someplace else." And I was being stubborn, but some way I just ended up stepping in the door there at the Great River News, and there was Don Wagner. And the first thing he says is, "Bob, how would you like to become a printer?" And I said, since I had a little rotary typewriter when I was a young kid, that is what I want to be. And he said, "Well, you come to work Monday, and we'll train you." And went back to the mill, and one of the superintendents was there, and he was a Christian man and liked me real well. And he said, "I've got bad news for you, Bob." He said, "We have sold out the mill, and you will not be able to get full-time work here." And I said, "Well, that's not bad news. I've got good news." And he said, "What's that?" Well, I said, "I'm not telling you right now, but when I see how it works, I'll tell you." So I started working there and eventually became a printer. And finally, in the end of the story, I was publisher of a newspaper, a 3-county newspaper. And just, it's the way God led me. And of course, the ministry also was great for helping out in missions and things like that. I mean, the newspaper business, because I could print stuff for them. Walt Jensen came from Cottonwood to find me because they needed a pastor. And so we agreed on a day that we would come over there and candidate, and we did. And I didn't really like the spirit of the church, and I thought, no. I just notified them that no, we were turning down the call. And they said, "Couldn't you come and give us a second chance?" So I did. and they insisted they wanted me in. So I pastored that church then, and that's where then the Lord led me to buy the local newspaper, which had virtually gone broke. And I bought it, and we built it up and turned it into a 3-county newspaper, and it was very helpful too for the mission in Canada to do the publications and so forth from there. We were publishing a book, and we had a deadline for it, so it had to be finished, and by a certain time. It was a family reunion, and we were publishing a family book. And every time I thought I had everything set, setting up the type, they'd come in with another story they want to insert. And that was making it bad. But then my press quit impressing. I would just get 3 sheets run through, and then the letters started to fade. And I did everything I could figure out. I couldn't find anything that would answer it. I got experts to come in and look and study it. They couldn't figure out anything. And time was running out. And so after being frustrated a lot, I was laying one evening in bed worrying, and I said to myself, I'm going to try praying instead of worrying, and that gave me peace. And then I fell into a dream, and Jesus was standing beside me. And he said, I'm going to show you what's the matter with your printing press. And so I walked up to the press, and Jesus walked up beside me, but I didn't see anything but his hand. And he put his finger on the impression level or lever, and he said, your problem is right in there. And in fact, before that, he went through all the functions of the press, and I said to myself, I didn't say it out loud, but I said, I know all of that. Why is he doing it? And then he put his finger on that, said, that's right where it is. And so then he repeated it all. And I was, why are we doing that? But after all, he knows more than I do. And then I woke up, and I was at peace, and I just thanked God, and I went to sleep, and I slept fine. 6 o'clock, I woke up, got right up, dressed, and headed for the print job. And I took the nut off that lever, and there was a little spring, just like that, and it was broken. And I went across the street to the farm machinery place and asked them if they had a spring like that. And the clerk took his ballpoint pen out and gave me the spring. And I went back and put it in, and the press was working. So that's the story on that. But as Jesus was telling me all the functions of the press, I had already learned early in my time of learning printing, you don't say, yeah, I know that, to someone who is teaching you, because you're not going to learn anything, because then they quit and leave it to you then if you know it. So no matter how well you know it, you just say, okay, yeah, okay, and think while they're talking. So that's about how that story goes. These very recent years that my faith has become to me so precious, and the reality of all of what all I'm looking forward to is so real. I remember once shortly after I came out of the military service, and I was driving somewhere and talking to the Lord, and I said something to the Lord about the progress I had made, and he just said to me, you didn't make that progress, I did. And that hit me with such a reality that I kind of became a Pentecostal and began to shout praises to the Lord. It was a great experience. Our dear Father, I am so thankful for the children and grandchildren that you've given me. I pray the blessing of God upon each of them to keep them on track, following you, to give them faith, to trust God in every circumstance, to see the hand of God and recognize it, and to have an expectancy in all they do and all their needs, that God does care and God will care. And Father, you have blessed us so much, and you've given Lorraine and me a family. Children are a blessing from the Lord. Blessed is the man who has many of them. So our God, send the blessing of God upon our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and we thank you for them, a gift from God. Praying in Jesus' name, amen.
I have heard of a land on the faraway strand. 'Tis a beautiful home of the soul, built by Jesus on high, where we never shall die. 'Tis a land where we'll never grow old. Never grow old, never grow old. 'Tis a land where we'll never grow old. Oh, never grow old, never grow old. When our work here is done, and the life crown is won, and our troubles and trials are o'er, all our sorrow will end, all our voices will blend with the loved ones who've gone on before. Never grow old, never grow old, 'tis a land where we'll never grow. Oh, never grow old, never grow old, 'tis a land where we'll never grow old. 'Tis a